Dean Mercer stood behind the velvet rope at the Ferrari SF90 launch when Sadie pointed at the scarlet supercar glowing beneath the showroom lights. "Dad," she breathed, "that car's absolutely beautiful." Dean smiled like a man looking at something he once owned. "Yeah," he said, "that Ferrari's mine." The VIP crowd burst into laughter. Tyler Knox looked at Dean's oil-stained jacket and his battered pickup outside and sneered, "Sure it is." Even Brooke, the event coordinator, began walking over to remove him. But 30 feet away, Claire Vaughn, CEO of Vaughn Performance Group, had stopped moving. She was watching Dean. Because why would the most powerful woman in that room hand a complete stranger the keys to a $1 million Ferrari? The Vaughn Performance Group's annual automotive showcase was the kind of event that separated people into two neat categories: those who belonged and those who stood at the edges pretending they didn't mind. The dealership floor had been transformed into something borrowed from a European motor show. Polished marble beneath track lighting, champagne flutes catching the glow of headlamps, and at the center of it all, a Ferrari SF90 Stradale painted in Rosso Corsa so deep it looked like frozen fire. The invitation list ran to 400 names, every one of them a decision-maker, a collector, or a person who had never once worried about a car payment. Valets in pressed jackets moved through the crowd with the quiet efficiency of people well paid to disappear. And somewhere near the back, a jazz trio played Coltrane at a volume carefully calibrated to suggest sophistication without actually demanding attention. It was the kind of room that made ordinary men feel invisible. Dean Mercer was not invited. He had driven 40 minutes across town in his F-250 with 220,000 miles on the odometer, and he had Sadie buckled in the passenger seat with a permission slip for a school field trip folded in her jacket pocket because he had meant to sign it and kept forgetting. Sadie was 9 years old and possessed the single-minded enthusiasm of a child who had grown up in a garage and therefore understood, in the bone-deep way that only mechanics' daughters do, that a beautiful engine is a thing worth driving across town to see. She had spotted the event poster at the gas station 2 weeks prior and pointed at it without saying a word. Dean had looked at it for a long moment, and then he had said, "We'll go." That was the thing about Dean Mercer. He rarely made promises, but the ones he made, he kept. They had parked in the overflow lot and walked to the entrance, where a velvet rope divided the world into two clean halves. The security attendant had not been unkind exactly, but she had been precise. "Wristbands for invited guests only, sir. The viewing area is available to the public along the south wall." So Dean and Sadie had gone to the south wall, and Sadie had pressed her face close to the glass partition, and Dean had stood behind her with his hands in the pockets of his canvas work jacket, the one with the faded logo from a shop that no longer existed. From where they stood, they had a clear line of sight to the SF90, and Dean looked at it the way a man looks at a photograph of a place he used to live. Sadie glanced up at him and said quietly, "You always look at Ferraris like you miss them." Dean didn't answer. He just kept looking. The crowd nearest the rope was the kind that wore watches worth more than most people's cars and spoke loudly about their last trip to Maranello, as though Maranello were a neighborhood they had grown up in. Tyler Knox was at the center of that group. Mid-30s, square jaw, the kind of confidence that comes from never having been seriously wrong about anything important in a room full of people who agreed with him. Tyler distributed luxury car financing for a firm whose name appeared on the event banners, which gave him proprietary access to the roped-off area and the loose, easy manner of someone whose invitation had come with a parking spot. He had noticed Dean the way people like Tyler always noticed people like Dean, quickly, categorically, and with a mild contempt that didn't require much conscious thought to sustain. When Sadie had said, "Dad, that car's absolutely beautiful," and Dean had laughed softly and replied, "Yeah, that Ferrari's mine," Tyler had turned and looked at the worn jacket, the oil along Dean's knuckle creases, the battered truck visible through the glass doors at the far end of the lot. And he had laughed the way people laugh when they want everyone within earshot to understand they are laughing at something beneath them. Two of his associates joined in. A woman in a white blazer covered her smile with 2 fingers but didn't bother to hide it entirely. Brooke Ellison, the event coordinator for the evening, had been moving through the crowd with the controlled velocity of someone managing 14 simultaneous problems. She was good at her job, which meant she was good at reading rooms, and the small flare of mocking laughter near the south partition registered in her peripheral awareness, like a minor interruption she needed to address before it became something messier. She started toward Dean with the practiced, professionally neutral energy of a person about to ask someone politely to relocate, the kind of request that doesn't quite sound like a request. She was about 20 feet away when she noticed that Claire Vaughn had stopped walking. Claire Vaughn did not stop walking often. She was 41 years old, had taken over her father's regional dealership group at 34 and turned it into the largest independent performance car distribution network in the Pacific Northwest. And she moved through rooms with the unhurried certainty of someone who had long since stopped needing to prove anything to anyone in them. She had been crossing the floor toward the product team when she glanced toward the south partition, not for any reason she could have named afterward, and saw a man in a canvas jacket standing behind the glass, looking at a Ferrari the way no one else in that building was looking at it, not with desire. Not with the performed appreciation of the extremely wealthy. He was looking at it the way an engineer looks at a thing he helped build. Her feet stopped moving before she consciously decided to stop. She watched him for a long moment. Then she reached to the lanyard at her wrist, unclipped the key fob for the SF-90, and threw it, not handed it, not carried it over with a polite explanation, threw it clean and flat 20 feet through the air directly at Dean Mercer. And the room went completely quiet. The key landed in Dean's right hand without him appearing to reach for it. It was the kind of catch that happens when a person's reflexes are calibrated to something faster and more consequential than the situation requires. The instinctive response of someone who had caught things under conditions that mattered. He stood there with the fob in his palm and looked at Claire Vaughn with an expression that wasn't quite surprise, though it wasn't quite ease either. It was the expression of a man recalibrating rapidly and choosing in the space of 2 seconds not to give anything away. Around him, the VIP section had gone very still. The jazz trio played on for 4 more bars before the pianist noticed the silence spreading through the room and gradually brought the melody down to almost nothing. Brooke Ellison had stopped moving entirely. Tyler Knox recovered first, which was what Tyler Knox always did in situations where silence threatened to reorder the hierarchy. "You're letting him touch that car?" His voice carried the specific register of a man performing indignation for an audience he expected to be already aligned with him. Claire didn't look at Tyler. She was still watching Dean, and her expression was the expression of someone who had done something instinctive and was now waiting to see if the instinct was correct. "I want to see something," she said, quietly enough that Tyler had to decide in real time whether to push back or absorb it. He absorbed it, but his jaw tightened in a way that anyone watching him closely could read. The security attendant unclipped the velvet rope and stepped aside without needing to be told. Dean handed Sadie the permission slip from his jacket pocket. "Sign that when we get home, sweetheart," and walked toward the SF-90 with the measured, unhurried pace of someone entering a space he was already familiar with. He didn't go to the driver's door. He didn't look at the interior first, or the wheels, or the prancing horse badge. He went to the rear of the car, crouched slightly, and placed his left hand flat on the engine cover, not examining it, listening. Several people in the crowd exchanged uncertain glances. Naomi Reed, A motoring journalist who had been documenting the event lowered her camera slightly and watched Dean with focused attention, her professional instincts overriding the social script she had been following all evening. Claire Vaughn's director of operations, Marcus, leaned toward her and said quietly, "Should I?" Claire raised one finger without looking at him. Marcus went quiet. Dean straightened up from the engine cover and walked calmly to the driver's side, keyed the fob, and settled into the seat with the particular familiarity of someone who has occupied that position many times before. The interior of the SF-90 is a dense environment, an instrument cluster with more data outputs than most aircraft cockpits, a hybrid powertrain management interface, drive mode controls mapped to a steering wheel that resembles a racing derivative more than a road car component. Dean did not look around with the expression of a man encountering it for the first time. He looked at it with the quick, professional inventory of a person checking on something they already understood. He started the engine. The SF-90's V8 hybrid powertrain came to life with the particular bark and settle of a high-revving Italian engine, and the sound filled the showroom floor and bounced off the marble and glass in a way that made the champagne glasses hum faintly on their trays. Dean sat with both hands on the wheel and said nothing for approximately 10 seconds. Then he switched the powertrain to electric-only mode, listened to the near silence of the motor, and frowned, a small, contained expression that wouldn't have read to anyone more than a few feet away. He brought the engine back up. He listened again. Claire was standing 5 feet from the driver's door, watching his face. "How did you know?" she asked, and her voice had lost the measured CEO composure it had carried all evening. It had become the voice of someone who genuinely wanted the answer. "Know what?" Sadie said from behind the rope. "Because somebody tuned it wrong," Dean said. He said it without drama, the way a plumber says there's a blockage in the line. Diagnostic, flat, certain. Tyler Knox made a sound that was meant to be a laugh but landed as something tighter. "Guy off the street decides Ferrari's engineers got it wrong," he said. Claire still didn't look at Tyler. Naomi Reed had her camera up and had taken several steps closer. Dean got out of the car with the unhurried ease with which he'd gotten in, set the key fob on the roof, and turned to look at the SF-90 with an expression that was almost fond. On the instrument cluster behind him, a warning indicator had illuminated, amber, small, steady, in the engine management display. Several engineers from the product team who had been stationed near the back wall began moving toward the car very quickly. They had seen the warning before Dean said a word. They had not mentioned it until this moment, because no one wanted to be the person who flagged a fault at a launch event. Dean had just said it for them, in front of 400 people and a journalist with a very good camera. The product team's lead engineer, a compact man named Phil Garrett, who had been with Vaughn's technical division for 11 years, crouched in front of the instrument panel, with the expression of someone trying very hard not to look alarmed in a professionally consequential setting. The fault code was specific, a calibration discrepancy in the hybrid torque split mapping that wouldn't have shown up in standard diagnostic cycling, but would have expressed itself as a subtle hesitation in mid-range throttle response under sustained load. It was, in the taxonomy of Ferrari engineering, a minor issue, but it was also the kind of minor issue that demonstrated unambiguously that something had been done incorrectly at some point between the factory and the showroom floor. Phil looked at the code for a moment, then at Dean, then back at the code in the way a person looks back at something they don't want to be true. Tyler Knox saw the opening and moved into it without hesitation. Whatever he did when he started it, he began, addressing no one in particular, but pitching his voice for the room. Claire raised her hand without turning around, and Tyler stopped mid-sentence. Phil Garrett stood up from the instrument panel and said, quietly but clearly enough for the people nearest the car to hear, "It was already there." Dean walked back to the car without anyone asking him to, and crouched beside the rear access panel. He didn't ask for tools, which meant either he planned to do something that didn't require them, or he had assessed the situation quickly enough to know what was needed before anyone else had finished processing the fact that there was a problem. The crowd maintained its loose ring around the SF-90, no longer performing disinterest, no longer pretending to be engrossed in champagne or conversation. Naomi had her camera up. Sadie stood at the rope with her arms folded on the top of the barrier, watching her father with the quiet confidence of a child who has watched him do things that seemed impossible often enough, that impossible had ceased to be a useful category. What happened next did not take long. Dean worked without speaking in the way that surgeons work in silence, not because he was shut down, but because the conversation was between him and the car, and it didn't require translation. He made several specific adjustments to the calibration interface through the engine access point, checked 2 physical connections in the hybrid module, and asked Phil Garrett, once, for the reading from the diagnostic unit. Phil read it aloud. Dean made one final adjustment. The amber light went out. No one applauded, exactly, but the exhale that moved through the nearest segment of the crowd was audible and collective. Phil stood in front of his laptop with the expression of a man who had just watched someone parallel park a semi-truck in a space most people wouldn't have tried with a compact. He looked at his diagnostic unit for a long moment and then said, very quietly, "How did you know where to look?" Paige Mercer had been dead for 4 years by then, and the story of what Dean had walked away from when she got sick was known to almost no one in the United States. What the people at the event did not know, what almost no one in the American automotive world knew, was that Dean Mercer had spent 7 years as a test and development engineer for Ferrari's performance division in Maranello, and before that 2 years at the Fiorano test facility, and that during those 9 years he had been involved in the calibration and validation of powertrains that had gone on to win at Le Mans and at Monza and at Silverstone. His particular expertise, identifying misalignment between a car's physical behavior and its control mapping under real-world load conditions, had been considered distinctive enough that his team had joked, affectionately, that he didn't listen to engines so much as he heard them confess. He had been 31 years old when he walked away. He had never told anyone in the industry why. Some engines stop talking when the wrong people touch them, Dean said. He said it without any particular emphasis, the way a person states something simply true and not requiring defense. Phil Garrett looked at him for a moment, then at the SF-90, then back at Dean, with the expression of someone performing a rapid biographical reassessment. Dean stood up, checked the alignment of the access panel, and closed it with the particular firmness of someone who knew the exact amount of force required. He turned to Sadie. "You hungry?" She gave him the look 9-year-olds give when they suspect they're being managed, and then she grinned. "You just fixed a Ferrari," she said. "I think I can be hungry." The SF-90 started perfectly the second time. No warning lights, no hesitation, the hybrid system cycling between its electric and combustion modes with the seamless, calibrated precision that Ferrari's engineers had intended. Phil Garrett ran the full diagnostic sequence twice, not because he didn't trust the first result, but because he trusted it enough that he needed to be certain. The data came back clean. Whatever had been wrong was no longer wrong, corrected by a man in a canvas work jacket who had not asked for a tool or a schematic and had taken less than 15 minutes to do what Ferrari's North American service team would likely have required a full diagnostic day to accomplish. Naomi Reed had moved to a better angle and captured footage of the repair that she would later describe in print as the most technically confident automotive intervention she had witnessed outside of a professional pit lane. The crowd had not dispersed. If anything, it had contracted closer, The way a group of people who have been pretending something interesting isn't happening finally stop pretending. Tyler Knox was still in the room, but the geometry of the social space had shifted in a way that left him at the edges of it, which was not a position he occupied naturally. Claire said, "You should come inside the rope." It was not phrased as a question. Dean looked at Sadie, who was already straightening up from the barrier with the particular energy of a child who has just been invited somewhere good. A staff member appeared with 2 wristbands, and for the next hour Dean and Sadie occupied the VIP section of the showcase as naturally as they had occupied every other space they had ever been in. Which is to say, slightly apart from the formal social rituals of the room, content to look at the cars and the engineering and to eat the food. Sadie, encountering a full canapé spread for the first time in her life, addressed it with the disciplined enthusiasm of a 9-year-old who knew not to make it obvious. "This is really good," she told a server, with great seriousness. The server appeared genuinely pleased. Claire found Dean near the technical display along the far wall, looking at a cutaway model of the SF-90's hybrid architecture. She had managed to exit 2 separate conversations with major account holders without appearing to exit them, which took a skill she had developed over years of running events she would rather have been watching from a comfortable distance. She stood beside Dean and looked at the cutaway for a moment. She was not a small presence even in a room full of forceful people. There was a particular quality to how she occupied space that had nothing to do with her title or the size of her company. It was the quality of someone who was exactly what they appeared to be. "You talk about Ferraris like family," she said. It was partly an observation and partly the opening move of someone who had spent a career negotiating by understanding what the other person actually wanted. And what Dean Mercer actually wanted, she was becoming convinced, was something different from what anyone else in this building wanted. Dean considered the cutaway for another moment. "I spent years listening to them more than people," he said. It was not a complaint. It had the quality of something that had not been said aloud in a long time and was being tested carefully to see how it sounded in the air. Claire absorbed it without comment, which was a specific social intelligence, knowing when the right response to a true statement is silence. Sadie appeared at Dean's elbow with a small plate and the expression of someone who had made excellent choices. She looked up at Claire Vaughn with the direct appraising attention of a child who has not yet learned to modulate assessment. "Are you the one who threw the keys?" she asked. Claire said yes. Sadie considered this. "Good throw," she said, and went back to her plate. Claire looked at Dean, and for the first time that evening she allowed something to reach her expression that was closer to genuine amusement than the polished professional warmth she had been maintaining for 4 hours. Dean noticed. He also noticed that she had not mentioned, yet, where she had heard of him before, and he had begun to suspect, from the specific way she had looked at him when she threw the key, that the throw had been less impulsive than it appeared. What he did not yet know was that Claire Vaughn had spent the past hour with one part of her attention on her phone, reading a very specific name in a very specific set of archived engineering documents from a European performance division. She set her glass on a passing tray and said, "I'm going to need you to come back tomorrow." Claire Vaughn was methodical by both nature and training, and she spent the 2 hours after the event doing what she always did when she encountered something that didn't fit her existing model of a situation. She assembled information. The name Dean Mercer appeared in the Ferrari North America archives in 2 places, a technical correspondence file from 9 years prior, and a single reference in an internal document from the Performance Division's European operations, identifying him as the calibration lead on a specific powertrain project whose test data had subsequently been cited in 3 separate engineering papers. The reference was brief, almost an aside. But Claire had worked in performance automotive long enough to understand that the casual mention of a name in a document of that type was the equivalent of a nod from someone who did not nod at many people. She made 2 phone calls that evening. The first was to a contact at Ferrari North America, who confirmed that a Dean Mercer had indeed been associated with the Maranello division, but that he had departed approximately 9 years ago and that no forwarding information existed in their records. Not unusual for a departure that had been abrupt and not followed by the standard consultancy arrangements that most senior engineers maintained. The second call was to Warren Hale, who had been the technical director of Ferrari's Fiorano development program for nearly 2 decades and was now semi-retired in Colorado, consulting on racing programs that interested him and declining the ones that didn't. Warren picked up on the 4th ring and said, "I was wondering when someone would find that name." The story Warren Hale told was not complicated. Dean Mercer had arrived at Fiorano at 22 as a graduate placement from a mechanical engineering program that Ferrari's European talent scouts had found through a regional competition, the kind of obscure pipeline that produced 3 or 4 exceptional engineers a decade and occasionally something more. He had been, in Warren's estimation, the most naturally gifted powertrain calibration engineer he had supervised in 18 years of technical direction. Not the most educated, not the most technically decorated, the most naturally gifted, which is a different category, the kind of thing that happens when a person's intuition and their training arrive at the same point simultaneously and produce something formal methodology alone cannot replicate. He had also been, Warren said, constitutionally unsuited to the performance of brilliance in rooms that required it to be performed, which meant his reputation inside the program had been considerably larger than his reputation outside it. Paige had been diagnosed when Sadie was 3 months old. The prognosis was the kind that produced a particular variety of silence on phone calls between people who loved each other. Dean had told Warren with a directness that Warren recognized, later, as the directness of a man not asking for accommodation but explaining a decision already made. He was going home. He sold what needed to be sold and came back to the Pacific Northwest, where Paige had family, and took a job at a regional service shop where the work was honest and the hours were predictable and no one needed him to be anything more than competent. Paige had held on for 4.5 years, which was longer than the initial prognosis. Dean had been at the shop and at the hospital and at home with Sadie, and when Paige died he had continued the life he had already built around her absence, which was the thing that people who had not watched it happen up close tended to miss. That grief, when it arrives at the end of a long preparation, is not so much a rupture as a continuation of something that has been accumulating for years. Sadie was 9. She had grown up in a garage where a man fixed other people's cars with the quiet thoroughness of someone for whom the work itself was sufficient. She had never heard of Fiorano. She knew her father had worked on racing cars in Italy before she was born because there was a photograph on the kitchen shelf. A paddock shot, helmets, and timing boards, her father's face several years younger and slightly more open. But she had understood, in the way children understand things that adults don't explain, that this was a closed subject, closed not by prohibition, but by weight. She told Claire Vaughn at the event, without any particular ceremony, Dad stopped building race cars after Mom died. She said it the way a child states a fact they have long since made peace with. Claire had been quiet for several seconds after that. Warren Hale, on the phone that evening, said to Claire in his precise, unhurried way, "Dean Mercer was the best I worked with. The fact that no one knows that is not an accident. It's a choice he made. And I would ask you to be careful with it." Claire sat with that for a long time after the call ended. By the following morning, Ferrari North America had already reached out to Vaughn Performance Group with a very specific inquiry, and Claire was going to have to tell Dean about it, whether she wanted to complicate things or not. Naomi Reed's article ran 4 days after the event under a headline precisely calibrated to produce the maximum amount of professional disruption while remaining technically restrained. Mystery Mechanic Corrects SF90 Fault at Prestige Launch Event. The piece described what had happened at the showcase with careful precision: the fault, the correction, the apparent familiarity of the repair. And it declined to name the individual involved, which was partly because Naomi had not yet confirmed his identity, and partly because she was a good enough journalist to understand that the absence of a name in a story like this was more interesting than its presence. The automotive industry read it within 2 days and spent the next 3 speculating, which was exactly what Naomi had anticipated. Tyler Knox had expected something different. He had spent the days immediately following the event constructing a version of the story in which the fault had been identified by Vaughn's technical team and addressed in an orderly, professional manner consistent with the standards of the dealership group, and in which the role of the unnamed individual had been minor and not particularly notable. He had presented this version to 2 automotive media contacts before Naomi's article ran, and afterward, the version had the uncomfortable quality of a structure built too close to the waterline. It held but not comfortably, and everyone looking at it knew what would happen if the tide came in. Claire called Dean on the second day and asked him to come in. He arrived at the Vaughn Performance Group's main facility with Sadie. It was a Saturday, and the school calendar didn't accommodate much flexibility, and Sadie was given a tour of the service floor by Marcus, who had 3 classic cars under restoration at various stages. This occupied Sadie so completely that Dean was later unable to reach her by voice and had to locate her physically, covered in grease and deeply invested in an argument about carburetor settings with a man twice her age. Claire and Dean sat in her office with 2 coffees and a view of the lot, and Dean listened to the outline of Tyler's counter-narrative, the Ferrari North America inquiry, Naomi's article, and Warren Hale's name appearing in it. Warren had confirmed what he knew to Naomi by then, with characteristic precision and without embellishment. Dean said nothing for a while after hearing all of it. The Ferrari North America inquiry was specific. They were assembling a consulting team for the North American validation program on an upcoming hybrid platform, and they wanted to know if Dean Mercer was available. Claire had the email on her screen. She turned the laptop to face him and watched his face as he read it. He set the laptop back. "They'll want someone full-time," he said. Claire said that was possible. "Sadie's in 4th grade," Dean said. "She's got her whole setup at the shop, her tools, her bench. I can't move her." Claire had expected this, which was why she had already spent 30 minutes the previous evening calculating what a part-time consultancy arrangement with remote capability would look like. She slid a document across the desk. Dean looked at it. Warren Hale arrived in town 2 days later, which was not something Claire had arranged and which surprised Dean considerably. Warren appeared at the shop on a Tuesday morning in a rental car with Colorado plates and a coffee from the place down the street, and he leaned against the workbench while Dean finished a brake service on a 3 Series belonging to a regular customer. The 2 men talked the way men talk when they haven't spoken in nearly a decade, but the intervening time has been sufficiently explained by the things that happened in it. Warren said, simply and directly, that he had told the truth to the journalist because Dean deserved to have the record be accurate, and that he understood if Dean considered this an overstep, and that, either way, he had come because he owed Dean a conversation that had been pending for 9 years. Dean said he didn't consider it an overstep. He handed Warren a cup and they stood at the workbench, and Warren said, "You still hear them the same way?" Dean said, "Yeah." Warren was quiet for a moment. "Then this is a waste," he said, not unkindly. Dean said, "It's not waste. It's just different work." They understood each other. The public dimension of the story arrived with unexpected force on Thursday. When Naomi's follow-up piece ran with Warren Hale's full account and Dean's name attached to it. The automotive community's response was of the particular variety that happens when a story turns out to be true in a way that its emotional arc suggested, but that people had hedged their enthusiasm about in case it wasn't. It arrived fast and without much reservation. Tyler Knox issued a statement through the dealership communications team that was professional and generous, and appeared to acknowledge Dean's contribution without specifying what that contribution had been, which was the kind of statement that satisfied no one but offended no one either. Dean did not issue a statement. He was at the shop, and Sadie was at school, and the afternoon was quiet, and he had a fuel system to service on a Subaru that needed it. Claire had come by the shop 3 times in the 10 days since the launch event, which she told herself was because of the Ferrari North America coordination, and which was, additionally, because of other things she was processing with the honest self-awareness of a person who makes clear-eyed assessments professionally and understood when one was overdue personally. She had brought coffee each time. She had also fixed the leaking tap in the shop's back room without being asked, which she would have done for any facility she was responsible for servicing, but which she had done here with a particular attentiveness that Dean noticed and chose not to remark on. When she left on Thursday afternoon, she paused at the door and said, "Ferrari's coming next week. I'd like you to be there." Dean said he'd think about it. He was already thinking about it. She knew that, and she drove away. The Ferrari North America track event was held at a private facility outside the city, a 3-mile circuit with a long back straight and 2 technical infield sections that sorted drivers cleanly into categories of competent and very good. The event was officially a product validation showcase for invited media, industry partners, and select engineering consultants, but the actual purpose, which everyone present understood without it being stated, was the evaluation of the company's newest hybrid prototype in front of people whose assessment would carry weight when the program moved into its next phase. The prototype was not the SF90. It was the car that would succeed the SF90, and it existed at this point in approximately 3 examples, all of which were at the facility under conditions of the careful management that gets applied to things that cost more than most buildings. The name on the program sheet for the primary evaluation driver was a professional test driver of considerable standing who had done this kind of work for Ferrari on 2 previous platforms. His name was not Dean Mercer. Dean arrived with Sadie, which raised a few professional eyebrows that Claire had anticipated and quietly addressed in advance. Sadie Mercer at 9 years old was the kind of observer who required no management and could be trusted to ask the kind of questions that technical staff find flattering rather than exhausting. She was wearing the jacket Dean had given her, canvas like his, embroidered with the name of the shop, and she moved through the paddock with the confident orientation of a child who had been in working garages all her life and understood instinctively where to stand. So she was near the interesting things, but not in anyone's way. Several of Ferrari's North American technical staff noticed her noticing things and drew the obvious conclusion about whose daughter she was. Tyler Knox was at the event in his capacity as a regional distribution partner, which was a legitimate role he occupied with the slightly careful demeanor of a man who understood that the geometry of the previous week had not resolved in his favor and was not going to resolve differently by force. He had spoken to Claire briefly at the entrance. Claire had been professional. Tyler was capable of recognizing a final settlement when he experienced one, and he had the decency to experience it quietly. Warren Hale was there, standing near the technical tent with 2 Ferrari engineers who appeared to be taking his input very seriously. The evaluation driver had completed 2 laps in the prototype and was debriefing with the lead calibration engineer when Claire crossed the paddock with purpose and the expression of someone who has made a decision and intends to execute it cleanly. She was holding the prototype's key fob. The lead calibration engineer tracked her movement with the concerned attention of a man watching someone approach his most valuable asset with unknown intentions. And then he tracked the fob in her hand, and then he tracked her direction of travel, and he began to understand what was about to happen slightly before it happened. Claire stopped in front of Dean. The paddock had the concentrated, pressurized atmosphere of a technical event where everything is being assessed and most people are managing how they appear to be assessing. Claire was not performing. She looked at Dean with the direct, unmediated attention of someone who has decided the situation requires honesty more than management, and she said clearly, in a voice that carried to the people standing nearest, "If anyone here deserves this car, it's him." Then she threw the fob. Same arc, same precision, same flat trajectory as the first time. This time, Dean's catch was marginally more emphatic, which might have been because he was expecting it. The silence that followed had a different quality from the silence at the launch event. That silence had been the silence of people processing an unexpected social disruption. This silence was the silence of people who understood what had just happened technically and professionally, and were computing what it meant, arriving one by one at the same conclusion. Warren Hale was smiling. The evaluation driver was watching the prototype with an expression that might have been professional equanimity or might have been something more complicated. The lead calibration engineer had stopped looking concerned and started looking interested, which in engineers of his particular specialization is the more meaningful transition. Dean walked to the prototype the way he had walked to the SF-90, without ceremony, without performance, with the unhurried quality of someone for whom the car is not a test but a conversation already in progress. He sat in the driver's seat and ran through the pre-launch sequence from memory. He did not consult the briefing sheet. He did not ask the calibration engineer any questions. He did, briefly, close his eyes and sit with the car the way a musician sits with an instrument before a performance that has been building for a long time. Then he put it in drive. The lap times were not exceptional by the standards of what was possible in that circuit in that class of machinery, because Dean Mercer was not at this stage primarily interested in lap times. What the Ferrari engineers recorded and discussed at considerable length in the debrief that followed, and cited in the engineering notes filed with the program team in Maranello that evening, was the quality and precision of his feedback. Every calibration observation he made was specific, technically accurate, and targeted at the precise layer of the powertrain control logic where the behavior he was describing originated. Phil Garrett, who was at the event and had been careful to remain neutral since the launch, leaned over to Warren Hale during the debrief and said, quietly, "He doesn't drive it to find the limit. He drives it to find out where they went wrong." Warren Hale said, "Yes." Then he said nothing else because nothing else was needed. Dean did not take the full-time position that Ferrari North America offered 3 weeks after the track event. He considered it seriously, which was something he had not done with the previous occasions on which the industry had found him, and extended invitations he had no intention of accepting. He sat with the offer for 4 days, looked at it the way he looked at an engine before he started taking things apart, trying to understand what was actually there before deciding what to do with it. He talked it through with Sadie one evening at the workbench while she resharpened a set of drill bits with the focused precision of a child who had been taught that tools deserve the same care as the things they're used on. Sadie listened, and then she said, "Do you want to go back?" Dean said he didn't know. She said, "Then you don't." He looked at her for a long moment and recognized, as he had several times in the past 9 years, that his daughter was occasionally clearer about things than he was. He negotiated a consultancy arrangement with Ferrari North America that was calibrated, with considerable precision, to what his life actually was. Remote assessment work that could be done from the shop, periodic on-site visits that could be planned around school schedules, and a scope of engagement that left him the authority to decline projects whose requirements didn't fit the structure he had built. Claire Vaughn had been involved in the negotiation as Vaughn Performance Group's regional partner, and she had advocated for the terms with a specificity that suggested she had thought carefully about what Dean's actual constraints were, and had not needed to ask him to describe them. Dean noticed this. He did not say so directly, but he made her coffee the next time she came to the shop. And it was better coffee than usual, which in the particular language of people who communicate through the quality of practical gestures, meant something that both of them understood without requiring it to be said. The garage continued. The same regular customers, the same afternoon light coming through the bay doors, the same radio, usually a classic rock station that Sadie had strong opinions about, and periodically overrode with a podcast about engineering history that she had discovered, and that Dean with the expression of someone pretending not to be interested. Sadie had a workbench of her own now, properly equipped, and she used it with the methodical confidence of a child who had been shown how to do things correctly from the beginning and had understood that correctness was worth the patience it required. She was working on a quarter-scale engine model she had sourced in pieces from 3 different suppliers, assembling it from a technical manual written for adults that she read without apparent difficulty. Dean watched her sometimes without her knowing. The particular watching of a father who has realized that the most important work he has ever done has produced something that will outlast the worry. Claire came to the garage on a Thursday evening, 6 weeks after the track event, in a Rosso Corsa SF90 that she had borrowed from inventory, with the permission of no one because she owned the inventory, and therefore the permission was implicit. She parked it in front of the bay doors in the late horizontal light of an October sunset and got out and leaned against it with the easy posture of someone who has spent enough time around beautiful machinery that beauty no longer requires a formal posture. Sadie looked up from the workbench and said, without inflection, "Nice car," which coming from Sadie Mercer was a considered professional assessment and not a pleasantry. Dean was wiping down his tools in the way he always ended a working day, and he looked at the Ferrari, and then at Claire, and then back at the Ferrari with the expression that Sadie had named correctly the first time. The expression of a man looking at something he misses. Claire reached to the fob at her wrist and removed it with the unhurried ease of someone who has done the same gesture before and intends to enjoy it. She looked at Dean. "Still yours?" she asked. Dean looked at Sadie, who had set down her tools and was watching him with the serene patience of a child who already knew the answer. He looked back at Claire and the car and the last of the October light and the shop behind him with its photographs and its honest, small history. "Only when she lets me borrow it," he said. Claire threw the keys. Dean caught them, and this time he let himself smile.
Seconds, bro. I'm gonna just reset it, bro. There's no way. Yeah, let's just restart it at this point. That's crazy, bro. Black with Wukong, such a good game. Reset me, bro. This shit is a peak game, yes, bro. Definitely. Gotta preserve your health, bro. It's tough. Thank you all for the donations, guys. Appreciate you guys. First playthrough. I played this game a while ago. I'm yet to beat it, but I've played it before. Oh, well, I could buy some stuff. I only have 2 pieces of gold. Oh, I got 3,000 coins. Let me buy Damage reduction. See what it does.